Hello, my name is Emmanuel, and this is my presentation on Canadian correctional systems and rehabilitation. So today's question is, does Canadian correctional systems have a rehabilitative effect on offenders who have committed an indictable offense? So pretty much it's a tough answer. We're not going to give it away early. But first, before we give an answer to that, we need to analyze the rehabilitation strategies that are already in effect, how they're created, how they're implemented, and how effective they are in today's society on current offenders. More specifically, in people who have committed an indictable offense or higher, which is a pretty serious offense in Canada. And we also have to look at the socioeconomic factors of the prisons that they're being held in. So for them to rehabilitate, we need to make sure that our prisons will have a rehabilitative feel to them. Otherwise, it would be impossible to rehabilitate. Next, we'd have to look at the challenges that can also be involved in this. Rehabilitation is not easy. So for one to be able to make it possible, we need to understand the challenges and the barriers that we will face in that process. And finally, we have to look at the causes of reoffending. So maybe the rehabilitation processes and strategies are in place, but what causes offenders to go past that and still continue to reoffend is something else we need to look at. So first, we're going to look at the Intensive Rehabilitation Supervision Program, which is what's in place in most Canadian prisons right now. So pretty much it's low risk offenders. So pretty much people who have committed lower, less big type of crimes. They committed mostly minor crimes towards the public. They're underneath less supervision. And the people who have committed the high risk, which are high risk offenders, which are pretty much people like indictable offenders that we're talking about more specifically today, they're held with higher supervision. So how does that work, you may ask? So pretty much low risk offenders, as you can see, are given more freedom. Pretty much they have more jobs to do, they have access to more programs and more social type of events. They're also given more responsibilities throughout the prison, which I said it previously about the jobs as well. And they also have access to different prison programs. For example, rehabilitation programs where we see, as we've seen in society, that people who commit lower and less big crimes don't really reoffend that much, mainly because it was a petty crime. But they also have better access to rehabilitation programs because they're low risk offenders. They can do more social interactions, which actually helps them rehabilitate into society much better, which puts them at a low risk of reoffending. Now we're going to look at the high risk offenders who are an increase of guards. As you can see, they have less freedom, so pretty much they're supervised much more, as we said previously. They're less responsibilities. They don't have access to the same jobs that the low risk offenders do. And they also have access to less prison programs. So rehabilitation for high risk offenders is actually lower, mainly because they don't have this access to the same programs. They're put in less social situations because they're high risk offenders. They're not really allowed to be around the same amount of people as the lowest offender because they're lower risk, mostly for violent crimes in the prisons. So now we're going to look at the low risk offenders, what they have access to. So as I said earlier, prison jobs. This is one of the main rehabilitation processes throughout prisons. It allows them to gain responsibility for a job and a task, which is something that they will be doing when they get put back into society, which they will need to be able to do, at least to survive in society, is keep a job. So that's a good way for them to learn how to do that. They also have boot camps where they have exercise gurus come into prisons and do hardcore workouts with the prisons, with the people who are in the prisons, the offenders. That's usually a good one. A lot of that's for building character. It actually helps them maybe change their focus from violence to maybe something else. And now we have group activities as well. As I said, low risk offenders are more allowed to be around social environments, which actually helps them reoffend less. So group activities really help with that as well. As you can see, they're playing basketball here in the picture. It's like a simulation of a group activity that's going on. We also have high risk offenders here now. Private activities, usually a lot of one-on-one stuff that you see them doing. For example, like if you see them have a job, it usually would be when there's no one else around. Like for example, working in like a tool shed or tool like Smith type shop that they have in prisons. Usually those places, when they go for high risk offenders, are usually alone, and they're usually highly supervised. They usually have a lot of solo counseling as well. This is mostly how they rehabilitate high risk offenders. It's a lot of talking to therapists. They're trying to figure out what's wrong with the person, because crimes like murder, mass murder, all those crimes are at higher risk of people with psychopathy, and that's, needs to be looked into as well, which is why there's solo counseling. They're also put in isolation a lot longer, which isn't the best, mainly because that takes them out of social situations. So when they go back into the public, if they do, they're not going to be that social, which is maybe a part of the rehabilitation process that the Canadian justice system needs to look at. Next, now we're going to look at the socioeconomic factors here. So we got the environment, pretty much. This is the socioeconomic factors of what it's like to be in a prison. So if the socioeconomic factors are negative, we're going to see a lot of violence, a lot of physical abuse, a lot of verbal abuse, and a lot of chaotic type of activities going on in the prisons. And that usually doesn't help towards rehabilitation. So we need to look at making sure that the prisons are stable, controlled, and have a more calmer environment. Next, we have to look at the population, because if it's like a zoo in there, it's going to be really hard to rehabilitate every single person because there's too much going on. They're not even worried about getting better. So population is something that needs to be looked at. But that also will look at pretty much, the crime rate in the country. That will also have to alter for that to deal with this. But that can also help, because the lower the population, there'll be less reoffending. People will be going in and out of jail less, which is what we want. And next, we have the quality of life in prison. So if the life sucks in prison, like it's super bad, like you're living in a rundown type of prison environment, that usually doesn't help with rehabilitation, because it's not that it's not enjoyable. We don't want to give them an enjoyable time, but it's really uncomfortable for an offender to live like that, mainly causing them to maybe rehabilitate less because they're unhappy where they are, of course. And next, we have the social support system. So if we lack those in some prisons, we will see less rehabilitation. We need the programs being put in place in the prison environments to help make the rehabilitation process a lot easier. Next, we're going to look at how those affect the offenders. So prisons with high-risk offenders, rehabilitation programs, are mostly available for men. As we see, a lot of the focuses on rehabilitation in prisons is mainly on men, because the male population is higher in prisons than the female is. So that makes it look like those women are given less attention. Statistically, they are. So that's something we need to look at here, is that women are given less attention in rehabilitation. So women can now argue that maybe they don't rehabilitate, putting them at a higher risk of reoffending, because there's less rehabilitation programs for women. So next, we have to look at the challenges. So for one, we have to look at the offenders, and we have to look at the compliance of the offenders. So pretty much, if an offender does not want to comply with rehabilitation processes, it's not going to be possible to rehabilitate that offender, because if they don't even want to get better, then the processes aren't really going to work. The stuff that's being said isn't really going to stick. So that's something we have to look at as well. Interest in the program. So we can't have programs that aren't interesting or don't interest offenders, because if they're not interested, they're not going to want to change, and that makes reoffending higher. So we have to make these programs worth it for the offenders, and we have to look at the mentality of offenders. So we have to look at if they want to maybe how deviant their behavior is. That then looks into more things that are like psychopathy, because they can't really control their behavior like that. Schizophrenia, looking at other mental disorders, that all comes into play when we have a mentality of offenders. But when we have an offender that's pretty stable, we usually can work with those. So it's good to have that as well. Next, we're going to look at the results of the challenges. So there's definitely a split. So pretty much we have offenders who want to comply with the instructions and offenders who don't. So clearly there's people, some of them, they won't give a tough time to people who work in prisons. They want to actually, some of them actually just want to do their time and get out. And those are the people that usually go through the rehabilitation process with an open mind, and they help this rehabilitation process because they go through it and they actually succeed, because they don't want to go through it again, pretty much. Next, we're going to look at there's a skewed rehabilitation results, mainly because offenders don't want to rehabilitate if they're put into bad environments, as we said earlier, with places that don't have good rehabilitation programs. And they're not gonna engage in rehabilitation processes because, again, maybe if they're not interested, as we said earlier as well, and there's the lower rehabilitative effect because of all these results. So now we're gonna look at the causes of reoffending. So we're gonna look at, this is after they've done their prison sentence. They're gonna look at poverty, unemployment, substance abuse, lack of positive influence, lack of education. All of these are factors as to why someone can cause crimes again after. That's usually due to a lack of not building the right social skills that they could have in prison. Unfortunately, all these factors plus other factors as well, cause reoffending. Next, we're going to look at how to alter these outcomes. So studies show that positive psychology is actually one of the most positively influenced ways to use it, at least to help offenders improve in the rehabilitation process while they're in prison. So we're going to look at what positive psychology means, and it's the study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. So pretty much in society, there are factors that allow it to, go forward, which is people like, for example, being law-abiding citizens. That allows society to also go forward. People investing in the economy, that helps society. All these things are psychological factors, positive ones, that help society go forward. So if we can help teach these things in prisons, for example, teaching better social skills, that helps them come back into an environment and contribute to the psychology in the environment, making more positive psychology, making it a more positive environment as well. And now we have implementing positive psychology in prisons and rehabilitation processes, which is pretty much implementing having this type of environment while around offenders. It will definitely help it and rub off on the offenders, making them more likely to not reoffend in the future. And that ultimately leads to success. So finally, we're going to come to the conclusion. We're going to come to our final answer here. And the answer is that yes, the rehabilitation process does, the correctional system does have a rehabilitation process on the offenders, as we can see here, mainly because if they have the right environment, we have seen, and the rehabilitation activities, and they also have offenders that want to change, we will see rehabilitation continue to thrive. But if we lack all of these aspects, then it will be impossible to reach the goal of rehabilitation. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you, and have a good day.